Thank you all for joining us for our SICSS-Howard Mathematica guest lecture. I'm proud to introduce one of our SICSS-Howard Mathematica alums who will introduce our speaker. Make sure you stay tuned at the end of this talk. We'll close with a few resources that will help you get to know SICSS-Howard Mathematica if you're joining us for the first time.
Thanks, Nanette. My name is Erica Kemigoto, and I am a research scientist at the University of Arizona, and a recent Ph.D. graduated from the Department of Geography from the University of California, Santa Barbara. My research is in the field of risk and disaster, and I am also a SICSS-Howard Mathematica 2022 grad. And I am honored to introduce our guest, Desmond Upton Patton. Desmond Upton Patton is the Brian and Randy Shorts University Professor and the first Penn Integrates Knowledge University Professor. He has joint appointments in the School of Social Policy and Practice and the Ann Arbor School for Communication, along with a secondary appointment in the Department of Psychiatry in the Pullman School of Medicine. Professor Patton's groundbreaking research into the relationship between social media and gang violence, specifically how communities constructed online can influence how often harmful behavior offline, has led to his becoming the most cited and recognized scholar in the increasingly important area of social science. His early work attempting to detect trauma and preemptive violence on social media led to his current roles as an expert on language analysis and bias in AI, and as a member of Twitter's Academic Research Advisory Board and Spotify's Safety Advisory Council. As a social worker, Patton realized existing gold standard data science techniques could not accurately understand key cultural nuances in language among predominant Black and Hispanic youth. In response, he created the contextual analysis of social media, or CASM, approach to center and privilege culture, context, and inclusion in machine learning and computer vision analysis. CASM can be applied by business and other organizations to observe social media and workplace communication channels for potentially incendiary language, which taken out of context can lead to violence. With this methodology, organizations can better foster diverse and inclusive environments and minimize employees' conflict. Further, Patton's insight on creating non-biased and culturally nuanced algorithms give tech companies a holistic perspective on various business and social issues. The companies that adopt these proactive measures are then able to ensure they are not unintended propagating bias. Welcome, Professor Patton. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. Today, I want to focus on the broader impact social media has had on gun violence prevention and how I use artificial intelligence to do this work. For almost a decade, I have understood and studied social media as a neighborhood, an environmental context where you spend an enormous amount of time building community, exchanging ideas, developing and running social movements, and on the other end, engaged in and exposed to trauma, harm, grief, and violence expressed in text, video, images, live stream, and the like. Critical to this journey has been an intentional transdisciplinary approach, an integration of ideas and theories and methods in order to define and analyze and widely disseminate findings and challenges surrounding this new area of study of social media and gun violence. My work has been powered by the SAFE Lab, for which I am the founding director. The lab is focused on examining the ways in which youth of color navigate violence on and offline, drawing on computational social work approaches to research and communication theories. We engage in qualitative and natural language processing methods to understand mechanisms of violence and how to prevent and intervene in violence that occurs in neighborhoods and social media environments. So the problem of social media as a trigger or amplifier of gun violence is not just a story about how users engage social media platforms. It must also contend with how platforms are designed, how artificial intelligence and other emerging tech tools are deployed to control what you see in the community guidelines that are developed to mitigate harm for some. The problem of social media and gun violence is a transdisciplinary issue that requires an integration of not only methods and theories, but also a reimagining of who was at the table, what true community collaboration looks like, and a century of marginalized voices, ideas, and beliefs that goes beyond checkboxes and window dressing. It also requires a 21st century research infrastructure that supports inclusive and equitable mass collaborations, transparency, and deep and critical reflection and reflexivity around potential harms and identifying your non-negotiables as a standard science practice. So I believe that social work should be at the forefront of technology design, development, and deployment of real-world applications, working alongside our social science and hard science colleagues and data science colleagues as well. I posit the idea of social work thinking as an apparatus of social change within the context of artificial intelligence design. Social work thinking leverages the National Association of Social Work Code of Ethics, ideas like honoring the dignity and worth of every person, centering the importance of human relationships, and engaging in trustworthy practices that anchor how social work thinking can be applied for ethical AI design. So my work is really motivated by two issues. One, gun violence is an epidemic, particularly in the United States. And in cities like Chicago, it is particularly acute. Now, during the height of my research in this space, the city of Chicago was experiencing an immense increase in homicides, in particular, a 58% surge in homicides and shootings. And at the same time, you also see young people using social media at an enormous rate. And at the height of my work, Twitter was particularly prevalent among young Black youth. So what we've seen over the last decade or so is a merger of complex beefs and taunts within and between crews and cliques that are expressed in short, pithy posts and images that lack context, nuance, or any broader explanation. So what we see now is what Jeffrey Lane calls the digital street, or what Robin Stevens calls the digital neighborhood. The digital street is subtly different from the physical street in that it alters how people connect and it restructures daily life by shaping identities and how people connect and engage in both online and offline spaces. And so I'm going to take you on a little journey through my career. In 2012, I was studying violence in Chicago, and I was particularly interested in how young, high-achieving Black boys and men navigate violence in their community in the West Side of Chicago, while also being high achievers, 4.0 students. And one of the things that continuously came up in our one-on-one conversations was the impact and role of Twitter in their life. And the thing that kept coming up was Twitter was life for them, and that Twitter was particularly helpful in navigating safety, and that it helped them to identify safe and unsafe locations. And so they were able to cognitively geocode safety in ways that allowed them to remain known and connected and seen in their neighborhood so that they could be trusted and so that they can meander through the neighborhood safely. It would also allow them to build skills that they can then apply within the school context as well. These young people also alerted me to some things that were popping off on Twitter. And one of the main catalysts for the work that I've been doing over the last decade is the beef on Twitter between Chief Keef and Little JoJo. And so to make a long story short, Chief Keef and Little JoJo, both from the South Side, one from the gangster disciples, one from the Black disciples, and they were going back and forth on Twitter. And Little JoJo was fed up with the back and forth and was like, hey, if you want to do something about it, meet me here. So he posted his exact location on Twitter. Within 3 hours, he was murdered in that exact location. So I became really interested in understanding how and why that happened. And so with some classmates, from the University of Chicago, we decided to write a conceptual paper. This is one of the first conceptual papers to define this idea of internet banking, or some people might refer to it as cyber banking. And in this paper, internet banking is simply a play on words for gang banging, and we interrogate the computer-mediated communications literature. We looked at hundreds of YouTube videos to really try to put some definition and some parameters. We also thought about the role of masculinity as a vehicle by which people may engage and connect with one another online as well. And we also wanted to think about hip hop as another apparatus through which lyrics may be shared on social media as a way of indicating potential violence or being a signal for potential violence as well. So none of this work could be done without true partnerships with community-based organizations. And one of the first community-based partnerships that I was able to develop was with the Chicago YMCA Violence Prevention Program, which was then co-directed by Eddie Bocanegra. And I remember it very clearly. I reached out to Eddie because Eddie was also an alum of the Crown Family School at the University of Chicago. And I wanted to work with some of his young people. And he essentially grilled me for about 2 hours when I was in a parking lot at Leona's in Chicago. And he wanted to make sure that I would be a good partner. He wanted to make sure that I would respect the young people, that I would not harm the young people. It was basically an IRB interview. And I respected that so much because it was critical to him that the deployment of any technology tools or even the pursuit of these types of questions within this community context would be done with care, would be done with lots of thought, and would not harm his young people. And so that began a relationship in which we then decided to partner together on the first internet banging study. Eddie and I applied for a grant at the University of Michigan, Office of Research, where I was an assistant professor between 2012 and 2015. We decided to engage on a qualitative study in which we would talk to around 34 Black boys and men and around 17 outreach workers. And our central research question at this time was, what's the role of social media and how does it impact gang violence? One of the most interesting findings from this project was what we learned from outreach workers. And then again, this is almost 10 years ago, over 10 years ago at this point. And we wanted to understand what they knew about social media and how they saw social media impacting their outreach work. So I wanted to share a quote from one of the outreach workers that really illuminates their understanding of the impact that social media is having. And so one of the outreach workers told me, so when someone dies, it hasn't happened since leadership found out, but when guys would die, they would make a Facebook page, such and such Rock's page, instead of Jose Garcia's page. So for instance, it would say Speedy Rocks, and then it would be a picture of him, and then someone would draw disrespectful symbols like a penis around his mouth and bloodstains all over, and it would feel more stuff. So here we get a clear indication of the ways in which a Facebook page, images and text might be altered to instigate a particular event following someone's death. And so we have the impact of grief and how grief can be disrespected and how grief and the disrespect of grief can be an amplifier or a trigger for offline violence. However, my research and my world fundamentally changed when I came to learn about Jakira Barnes. Jakira was exposed to violence at a very young age and had recurring experiences with death and loss. Just weeks after her first birthday, her father was shot and killed. As she entered her formative teenage years, she joined a gang in the Woodlawn neighborhood of Chicago. But the death that seemed to impact Jakira the most was that of her friend Tyquan Tyler, a 13-year-old boy who was murdered in her neighborhood. Actually, they were at the same summer party and she was just steps away from him. She then adopted the Twitter handle @TaekwonAssassin. And so this is the point in which I began to learn more about her, because in this Chicago Sun-Times article that describes Jakira after her death, the thing that they post in the article was her Twitter handle. The Chicago Sun-Times article that I had a chance to read called Jakira the gun-toting gang girl of Chicago. And so I began to read more intensely and realized that this particular narrative may help me to understand the signals that might amplify violence from a digital context, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, into an offline context. However, this is also a space where I am met with ethical challenges. This is also a space where I began to reckon with my own biases as a researcher, as a Black male researcher in this space. And one of the things that I began to understand and realize is that my imbibing of white supremacist and white toxic narratives of how we talk about young Black girls was a part of my own meaning making of Jakira. And so I saw her initially as this bloodthirsty killer. I translated her pictures in text as bad, negative, as opposed to reckoning with the fullness and the complexity and the nuance of who Jakira was. And so when I began to look at Jakira's Twitter life, and I had been bringing in those biases to that translation, well, I found exactly what I was looking for, right? So I would find tons and tons of tweets that would be deemed aggressive or problematic. Things like, Vernon, that's the gun line, you cross a unit, you end up on the headlines. Anyone can get these hands in this life. You see the ops bucket, we're gonna smoke them. These are the types of tweets that I would see regularly. But what Jakira did in death is that she forced me to reckon with her humanity. She forced me to see the fullness of her life. She forced me to see the grief and trauma that she had experienced. And so when I began to look at Jakira in entirety, then I saw tweets like, 4M, the ops killed my bro, broken heart. My struggle ain't been told. This particular tweet has sat with me since I began to look at Jakira's tweets, because what it tells me is that there's so much that we do not know about young people, in particular, young people that have been casted as problem, as bad, as negative. And she, through Twitter, is inducing this moment of pause and communicating to her wider network that there's a lot that we don't know. And so this particular tweet and others like it really helped me to engage in more reflexive practice around how I think about tweets and the types of methodologies that we might need to really center marginalized voices. Also, during this time, I realized that I didn't know what young people were saying online. I had no idea of how to interpret these posts, how to make meaning of them. And that was a really embarrassing, but also humbling moment as a researcher to understand where my expertise ends and where someone else's begins. And so I really had to think about either developing or leveraging practices that would force me to reckon with text and images and emojis in a way that would be thoughtful and that would bring about as much context and nuance as possible. So what we did is that we created a methodology called CASM, or the Contextual Analysis of Social Media approach. And through CASM, we provide a methodological process to contextually interrogating text and for developing domain-specific decisions to label social media data for the training of an algorithmic system. The CASM approach serves as a method to bridge the identified gap between inadequacies in current language processing tools and differences in geographic, cultural, and age-related variants of social media use and communication. CASM is meant to be a team-based approach for annotating and qualitatively analyzing social media data. So let's take this particular post here, right? And so in this post, Jay Smoking Thinking About Money, when we focus on identifying context, making meaning of emojis vis-a-vis the text, and by including community members who live in the neighborhood for which the social media data comes from, we begin to grapple with the various types of content that may be coming through. And so here we learned that there's a number of things happening in this post. So, on the face, you may think that this is just about smoking weed. And what we realize is that in some contexts, some community members may name the weed that they're smoking after someone that has been murdered as a sign of disrespect. And so this is not just about smoking weed, and this is not just about grief. There is disrespect underscoring this entire context that might be a signal for someone who might see this post, who might screen share this post, who might copy and paste this post, that could then be a trigger for offline violence. As I said initially, this work could not be done without our community domain experts. And one of the most important things that I think we've come to learn is that first we need to reimagine who can be experts in data science work, who can be experts in the deployment of AI and data science for real world problems. And what we learned is that by partnering with young people, we began to understand larger meaning, began to understand embedded context that would be hard to grapple with if you're not from the community. And so these young people we hired through partnerships with community-based organizations, and we would identify a mentor in those organizations to help support our relationships with these young people. And these young people would be paid like graduate research assistants, and they could work with us for 3 months or 6 months or a year, however long they could spend time with us. And they would help us to translate text, but they would also give us ethical feedback on how we were making meaning of posts and how these posts and our work in this area might impact their communities. In addition to CASM and our domain expertise collaborations, we also developed an annotation system that would allow us to engage CASM in a methodical process. And so we created VATAS, which is our annotation system, and it's meant to allow annotators to grapple with context around social media data. So I'm going to give you a short demo of how we would do this. And so we're going to take this tweet. I've been up for like 3 days straight. In the CASM process, we first want to get a baseline interpretation from the annotator. In our context, the annotator we have 2 types of annotators. One is our community domain experts, those young people that you just saw, and also students who are training to become social workers at the master's level that may have experience working in youth-serving organizations or working in communities of color, but they are not from the community from which the data comes from. And so we asked, in this situation, this is an MSW student, and we asked them to give us their first impression of this tweet. I've been up for like 3 days straight. And first, the annotator says he hasn't slept in days. Well, that's not really helpful. It doesn't give you a lot of context. You can't really do anything with that in terms of labeling. But the CASM process then asked the annotator to go through many layers of looking for and identifying context. And so we asked them to go back to the original post, to utilize web-based resources like Hip Hop Wiki, to go back to the author, to look at the peer network, to see if folks are connected. So for example, someone may say they're gang involved, but they're following Disney characters. So like that discontinuity there is something that we would see often. We asked the annotator to go to the offline events to see what the young people are talking about, to see if there is some offline situation that's impacting how we might interpret what we're seeing. We then think about the virality of a post and the engagement around a particular set of posts. So now the annotator has done all of that. They've gone through 7 steps of looking for context. And now the annotator has a lot more to say. And so in this description, the annotator says, this user is saying that he's been up for like 3 days straight, most likely meaning he hasn't slept in 3 days. This post comes days after his friend was killed. This user may be having difficulty sleeping because of his friend's death. He includes a persevering emoji and a flushed face emoji. So now we have more context to work with. So now when you're thinking about how we might label, I've been up for like 3 days straight, you now have more interpretive data to draw on to inform your labeling and annotation practice. We ask our annotators to then provide a label. This is always the hardest part of social science working with computer scientists because of this need to develop these binary classifications and to put complex human behavior into really small boxes, and yet we do. And so our predominant labels based on our qualitative work are grief and aggression. And then everything else that might be emerging is considered other. And so we want the annotator to then assign loss or aggression to a post like this. But before that happens, we then go back to those domain experts, right? We want to make sure that we're in line, we're thinking similarly in this area, because there's disagreement between the MSW student who's not from the community and the domain expert. The domain expert will oftentimes have, understanding of place and context or have a backstory. They may even know some of the individuals in the pictures or have an association or an affiliation in some way, or be able to help us make meaning of gestures, clothing, things that might be embedded in a picture that, to the untrained eye, you may not understand, but to someone who's from the community may have a deeper meaning as well. And so then this is the final step in our validation and our annotation process before this is then handed off to our data science colleagues. But we also wanted to see, does having hand label contextually informed posts work? And so when considering the question of whether it is worthwhile to manually annotate a corpus, it is useful to compare the performance of a model using this data to performance of the same model on a data set created without such investment or effort. And in this situation, our hand-labeled algorithmic systems were able to correctly find labels of loss and aggression 64% of the time versus an untrained algorithmic system that could only find labels of aggression and loss correctly 52% of the time. Again, this is far away from 100%, but what this does signal to us is that having context and spending the time to really grapple with meaning making, particularly in this vulnerable context, in this sensitive context, does matter for being able to correctly find labels automatically. And so this work is culminating in a book around Jakira's life. And I wanted to kind of sum up, what we've learned here, because, bridging qualitative and data science work becomes really critically important to understanding stories and how those stories and that storytelling can help us improve upon our data science methods. And what we heard from Jakira's mom was illuminating of why this type of work is critically important. And so what Jakira's mom told me, Ms. Brown, said, I was hurt and in pain. I was a million things, but I was numb to the fact because this happened so many times previously. What do I do now? What do I do? Do I do what other parents do? They don't want to talk about it. We're just waiting on the next kid to die. I never got a chance to really grieve because I had to jump back into life and going. I just vowed to her on her deathbed I wouldn't let her name go in vain. And so hopefully this work that we're doing with Jakira, combing through her Twitter life and hopefully producing complex and culturally nuanced posts is helping to support Jakira's mom's mission to keep her daughter's name alive and to hopefully prevent future violence. And so, as I said before, we then want to hand this off to our data science colleagues. I've had the privilege of partnering with Dr. Kathy McEwen, who is an expert in text summarization at Columbia University, and Dr. Shifu Cheng, who is the Dean of the School of Engineering at Columbia University. And he is an expert in computer vision. And so in our work together, we have attempted to predict aggression loss in other for unseen tweets within Twitter data. We have exploited large unlabeled data and use the context of the tweet to then attempt to automatically find these psychosocial concepts of aggression and loss. And so we developed the computational system that classifies tweets from our corpus into aggression, grief statements, or emotional other. Our supervised machine learning approaches utilizes training data labeled by the qualitative analysis coding team. And the data set in our initial experiment was very, very small. 616 tweets that were used to train the classifier and only 102 tweets that were used to tune the parameters of the classifier. And we started with a thick data approach as opposed to a big data approach because we were quite unsure that that the algorithmic systems would be able to grapple with this kind of combination of African-American English and social media speech. And so what we were able to then do was manually annotate parts of speech, and so that we can then train the algorithmic system to think like our domain experts. What we were able to do is then produce an F-score that was around 62%. And so we learned a lot from this initial experiment in that the AI systems were not good at grappling with context, that there was a need to engage in deeper annotation and meaning making. It's also a time where we began to understand that there are lots of harms that could be at play as well. I guess one of the most uncomfortable conversations that I had with my data science colleagues was around the AI system's constant labeling of the N-word as an aggressive term. And so I had to then explain to them that the N-word within the Black community is not necessarily an aggressive term. And so we need to make sure that we understand the broader meaning making, and to understand then what might happen if we turn this algorithm loose and it's constantly identifying the N-word as aggression. And if this tool isn't used in different contexts, say law enforcement, then what might transpire after that particular, after that algorithm is used within that particular context. And so we are also, it's not just about automatically finding these psychosocial concepts. There was another conversation that forced us to reckon with the ethics of doing this work as well. We then, in our second experiment, we added a new label data set that is 6 times larger than the prior work. We then also added domain-specific resources that are induced from the unlabeled data set. And we use context features that capture semantic and emotional content in users' recent posts and their interactions with other users. We grew the data set by then identifying Jakira's top communicators, individuals for which she had the most mentions and replies with, and we use a snowballing technique to then find other users that were also connected as well. But we wanted to start with those top communicators to grow that data set. And so we were then able to move our F measure from 62% to almost 70% by using more context. And so our approach shows that integrating emotions and semantic content of a user's recent posts is an important component for the task of predicting aggression and loss in social media posts. And furthermore, using domain-specific embeddings and an aggression loss lexicon induced from a corpus of language constructed to represent our specific community of users is also critical to our success. And then in our last experiment, we gathered almost 2,000 tweets and accompanying annotations related to visual concepts and the psychosocial codes of aggression, loss, and other. Aggression, loss, and now substance use, excuse me. We compare various methods for classifying tweets into these 3 classes using only the text of the tweet, only the image of the tweet, or both modalities as inputs for the classifier. Here's an example of the types of images we were able to identify using our computer vision tool. These are not images from Jakira's data set, but these are stock images that we compiled to be representations of the types of things that we found. And in this analysis, we found that computer vision was quite good at identifying visual concepts of aggression. And natural language processing was much better at identifying concepts of grief because of the ways in which people use words to express grief. And then both natural language processing and computer vision were equally as good at identifying substance use, like in picture E, the substance called lean, which is a combination of a cough medicine and Kool-Aid or Gatorade. So as you might imagine, there are lots of ethical questions at play here that we have to contend with and that are constantly sitting with me as I do this work. And so I think it's important to understand that this work sits between two critical issues. Number one, when I talk to Black families, they want their children to be safe and desire tools that help achieve those ends. So they don't care if, how we create the algorithm. If the algorithm is going to be helpful and it's going to allow their child to get to and from school, then that's something that they would want to hear about. But as a social worker and a social scientist, I also understand the digital surveillance and policing aspects of this work, how these tools might also be deployed to then surveil, hyper-surveil, continue to surveil Black and Brown communities, and that this particular work could enhance yet another form of state violence on Black people and the broader Black community. So I think that if we think about the deployment of CASM and VATAS, that there are a number of things that we should consider in this process. And so I think that CASM as an ethical, methodological process for annotating data should be accompanied with a robust set of ethical guidelines to consider. Number one, we must constantly consider the consequences of applying algorithmic tools to complex social problems. And we should really, at this point, be thinking about what are our non-negotiables? When is this helpful and when is this harmful? If you don't know, then what are the processes that you need to engage in to surface those particular biases? Two, considering measurement for success of NLP tools, is accuracy always the appropriate measure of success? What does it mean to have a tool that is accurate at assessing Black speech? Is that tool going to help us reduce healthcare inequalities? Is it going to help create more accessible mental health resources? Or is it going to fast track our ability to surveil Black communities and then push people faster into the prison industrial complex? And so at the end of the day, we need to be considering the extraction of context when using NLP and how language processing systems are derived, analyzed, and validated. And so as a social worker who's been in the violence prevention space for quite a while, I wanted to do this work to help develop platforms with communities for real-time social media updating. And so you're a violence outreach worker, you want to understand what's happening on social media to inform how you then will treat arguments or beefs that may unfold in an offline context. But we cannot develop this tool in the way in which I had hoped because of the ethical dilemmas that we are faced with. And so in some of my theoretical work, I've been developing conceptual frameworks to theorize how, in an era of big data and criminal justice practice, social media policing may adversely affect communities of color. So for example, I critique how race affects social media policing through the juxtaposition of social media use during the 2014 arrest of Black youth in New York City public housing, based on Facebook data compared to the post-hoc social media monitoring of Dylan Roof, the perpetrator of the Charleston church shooting in 2015 that killed 9 people, and the other individual who engaged in a shooting at a synagogue in Pittsburgh. These individuals had racist manifestos that had been up on platforms for months, and yet we didn't find them until after they had committed these murders, as opposed to the proactive surveillance of Black communities of young Black boys and men who may not have been connected on any criminal justice level at all, but because they lived in the same low-income housing in New York and may have had former affiliations by living in the same hall or in the same building, then that was enough evidence to build a case for their arrest. And so I want to leave you with a couple of things that I think are really important for us to be thinking about. I think social media is, I think we need to continue to understand social media as a community where youth live their lives, that it's not necessarily distinct from the offline world. And I think that social media can be a powerful tool for understanding and preventing root causes of violence. And I think that AI offers opportunity to augment and bolster current violence prevention efforts, but I do not think that we should use AI as a predictive tool for violence prevention. I rather think that AI can be useful in generating better research questions that help us get at root causes, that help us understand how young people relate and connect, that help us understand triggering events, but should not be used as a tool for identifying individuals because of the layered misinterpretation of context and the bias and racial bias that exists within all of us that can impact how we truly see and interpret social media posts. I think it's really important at every step of the way to engage in processes and collaborative data science teams that uncover and recognize personal and institutional bias, that we all have these biases and that we all need to engage in processes of unraveling them and addressing them as a part of the process. It's especially important to consider when using social media and AI for any violence prevention space. And most importantly, this work cannot be done alone. It should not be done with data scientists by themselves or computer scientists by themselves. It's important to have a critical and diverse perspectives and voices in the application of social media for AI and community safety. So we've learned a lot, and it's really changed the direction of our work. And so by engaging in these AI processes, it's actually done more to help us think about new ways of addressing community violence, new ways of asking questions, both qualitatively and quantitatively, and new partnerships that we had not pursued before. One of the things that we were able to do from our learning through this work has been to partner with the New York City Mayor's office to develop a neighborhood navigator tool in which we collect millions of social media posts alongside having an advisory board of low-income New York City residents to understand and see the similarities and differences in how people talk about well-being and challenges in New York City versus how on social media versus how they will talk about them within in-person interviews and focus groups. And so one of the things that we learned was about the connection between violence and well-being and affordable housing that I think was a really important finding for the mayor's office to understand that in terms of how you support community members, you have to think about the layers of life and connection and community that are important to thinking about how you then best use technology tools as support or intervention. We also think that it's important to have a more balanced perspective in this space. We now understand joy as a potential intervention for violence prevention. And so we have received a gift from Microsoft to work with young people in New York City and Philadelphia to understand and conceptualize joy and to then create platforms where young people can then connect around concepts of joy in both digital and physical spaces as well. And then lastly, we have also been partnering with computer scientists to then detect expressions of grief online. One of the findings that came out of our Jakira work is that grief would oftentimes precede more aggressive posts, right? And there would be a 2-day window between someone posting about grief and then their posting behavior shifting and morphing into more aggressive posts. And so we are working on a tool that can automatically identify these concepts of grief so that we can then train social workers and psychiatrists and psychologists to be able to leverage what's happening in digital spaces to inform better treatment plans as well. And so this work has informed the building of a new center at the University of Pennsylvania, the Penn Center for Inclusive Innovation and Technology. This will be a new site for building the public interest technology field. This center will fuse anti-racist framework, social work thinking, and rigorous analytical methods to tackle thorny social issues, to include gun violence, trauma, and grief, but not limited to as well. And so I want to invite you to collaborate with us at the University of Pennsylvania around these issues. We will have lots of core spaces for engagement, and want to make sure that you are aware of this new center that we're building at Penn. And so if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me via our SafeLab Gmail account. You can reach out to me directly in my UPenn email, or you can follow me on Twitter as well. Thank you so much for having me. Take care.
Thank you for joining us, Professor. I know our participants are looking forward to live Q&A and office hours with you during the Institute this summer. Thank you all for watching. For more information on SICSS-Howard Mathematica, visit our website, follow us on social media, and join our email list.